There is a version of you that you do not show to anyone, a silent presence that lives inside you, observing every choice you make, and especially every choice you avoid making. This part does not shout, does not expose itself, does not ask for attention. It only observes. And paradoxically, it is precisely this hidden version that can make your life deeply magnetic, capable of attracting situations, people, and paths that today seem distant. Perhaps you have already experienced something similar to what I'm going to describe now. A decisive moment, a clear opportunity in front of you. The heart races, the hands sweat, and something inside says with absolute certainty, this is the way, this is your path. But almost at the same time, another voice arises, more subtle, more distrustful, whispering, what if it goes wrong? What if you are not ready? Better to wait. And then what happens to so many people happens. You freeze. It is as if an invisible elastic band pulls you back to the same place as always. You know what you want. It is clear. It is vivid. But even so, you cannot take the next step. It is as if there were two versions inside you. One that dreams, that wants to grow, that wants to live something greater, and another that appears exactly at the moment of advancement to hold you back. This second version is rarely recognized, but it operates in the hidden. And when you do not notice, it is the one who is driving your life. Today, I want to invite you on an honest and deep journey, but at the same time, a light one. A crossing of self-knowledge that does not weigh you down, but awakens you. We are going to talk about this hidden part of the personality that Carl Jung called the shadow. I will show you how it is born, how it acts without asking permission, and most importantly, how this same force that today holds you back can be transformed into the force that will propel you forward. It will not be a heavy video. On the contrary, it will be one of those that when it ends, you feel that something in you has awakened. If you made it here, it was not by chance. There is a silent calling bringing you to this inner work, a calling to become exactly what deep down you fear, and at the same time deeply desire to be. For those who are arriving now, let us quickly clarify what the psychological shadow is. Jung was not talking about something evil or the bad side of a person. The shadow is something much more human. It is everything that you were not given permission to be. From an early age, you learned which behaviors generated approval and which generated rejection. And to survive emotionally, you created a character. The strong one, the good girl, the responsible one, the intelligent one, the one who solves everything. But what did not fit into this character was not eliminated. It was only pushed inward, repressed, hidden. And that is exactly what forms the shadow. The most surprising detail is that it does not contain only flaws, but also repressed talents, denied strengths, suffocated creativity, forgotten courage, and a voice that was silenced. In the shadow is everything that you could have been, but did not allow yourself to live. And that is why it bothers you so much, because it holds a version of you that already exists, but has not yet been lived. Perhaps you avoid being that creative person because deep down, you believe that you are not good enough to create something new, to innovate, to expose yourself. Or perhaps you avoid being free because freedom requires the courage to deal with your own desires. And freedom does not mean doing anything, but taking responsibility for your own choices. Perhaps you avoid being disciplined because discipline reminds you of rigidity, pressure, or harsh experiences from childhood and school. Or still, perhaps you avoid prospering because prospering would mean becoming different from your family, breaking a silent pattern, leaving the familiar place. Do you see how many times the part you fear is exactly the part that could set you free? Here is a crucial point. The version of you that scares you the most is, secretly, the version you admire the most. It is that image that appears in your thoughts before sleeping, in your most intimate dreams. It is who you would be if there were no guilt, fear, constant criticism, and comparisons. That powerful version did not disappear. It remains alive inside you, whole, pulsating. It was only exiled. The shadow did this believing it was protecting you. The good news is that you have grown. Today you can already recognize that this part is not dangerous. On the contrary, it is necessary for your growth. Life only truly begins when you make peace with this hidden version. Summarizing so far, the version you are afraid of becoming is the only one capable of taking you where you have always dreamed of going. A large part of life is a search for meaning, while, in parallel, a silent internal war takes place. The self that wants to grow versus the self that just wants to remain safe. And most of the time, the one that keeps you small wins. But this can change. This is where a fundamental concept comes in. The shadow is the guardian of your self-realization. Self-realization is not perfection nor eternal enlightenment. It is something human and possible. It is living the life you were born to live, and not the life your history tried to convince you to accept. When you realize yourself, you begin to express yourself with authenticity. You create your life aligned with a purpose. You prosper with freedom. You love with presence. And you make decisions with maturity. You stop asking for permission to exist. And here is the great turning point. You do not realize yourself despite the shadow, but through it. By looking at your wounds, you release strength. By welcoming what was denied, you recover energy. That is why this content is so important. While you do not understand what happens inside you, you continue fighting ghosts when you could be freeing your potential. Every journey has a key moment. Sometimes it appears after a loss, sometimes in exhaustion, and sometimes as an inner whisper saying, "Enough. You no longer need to live like this." Imagine your mind as a dark corridor, full of closed doors, each one holding a part of you. Most people spend their lives running through this corridor. But one day you stop in front of a door slightly open, from which a faint, persistent light comes out. This light is not a monster. It is a part of you asking to be seen. When you approach, this part reveals fears, repressed anger, unacknowledged pain, forgotten talents, and underestimated power. And here something essential happens. What you welcome stops dominating you. When light and shadow meet, you stop trying to please the world and begin to honor your own truth. From that point on, you no longer seek to be perfect. You seek to be whole. This meeting between light and shadow is what Carl Jung called the process of individuation. To individuate is not to become someone special or superior, but to become whole. It is to stop living fragmented, divided between who you show to the world and who you hide from yourself. And here it is important to make something very clear. Understanding what the shadow is not enough. Many people understand the theory, find it beautiful, agree intellectually, but continue living in exactly the same way. Why? Because individuation requires courage. It is not a distant mystical concept, nor something overly abstract. It is a practical process, but a demanding one. It requires presence, energy, and above all, action. The work with the shadow happens in steps, like an inner staircase. You cannot skip stages. The first step is honest observation, and truly honest, not idealized. Neither placing yourself on a pedestal, nor diminishing yourself. It is looking at yourself and asking, what do I really feel? Where do I get stuck? In which situations do I repeat the same patterns? Where does my life seem to go in circles? This observation is not to judge or to fix anything. It is simply to turn on the light. The mess was already there before. You just did not see it. The second step is acceptance. Here you learn something fundamental. Feeling does not destroy you. What destroys you is repression. When you say to yourself, okay, I feel fear, or yes, I feel anger, something organizes itself inside. Emotions are not enemies, they are messengers. They carry information that you ignored for years. To accept is not to agree, nor to sink into it. It is to allow that to exist without defining you. The third step is the conversation with the shadow. Once it is identified, you need to ask, what are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to protect me from? This is one of the most transformative parts because you realize that the shadow does not act out of malice. It tries to protect the child you were, the one who learned that dreaming big was dangerous, that standing out generated rejection. When you listen to this part, something realigns. You stop being unconsciously pulled and begin to lead your own life. The fourth step is the conscious choice. Here is the real turning point. It is when you decide to act even with fear. The shadow may shout, warn, try to convince you to retreat, but now the one who decides is you. This is the moment when you take the wheel of your life. The fifth step is action in the concrete world. Without action, nothing changes. Individuation only happens when you say what you never had the courage to say, position yourself where you always annulled yourself, make choices aligned with your values, and abandon what no longer honors who you are. It does not need to be perfect nor grand. It needs to be true. The sixth step is conscious repetition. The shadow does not disappear all at once. It returns, tests, provokes, and that is fine. Individuation is not an event. It is a continuous process. Over time, you realize that you no longer fit into your old version of yourself. And then we arrive at the seventh step, becoming who you are afraid to be. This is the point where you stop running from your own light. It is not the fragile self that fears change. It is the powerful self that fears being seen. When you understand this, the shadow stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. It gives back what it was holding: your voice, your boldness, your authenticity, and your purpose. There is a very specific moment in the journey of anyone who begins to awaken to themselves. It is not a loud moment, nor a spectacular one. Most of the time, it arrives as a silent discomfort, a feeling that the life you are living no longer fits inside you. It is like wearing clothes that have become too small. Nothing is exactly wrong, but everything feels out of place. And then the question that changes everything arises. Are you ready to become who you are afraid to be? This question is frightening because it touches the most sensitive point of the shadow. Contrary to what many people believe, the greatest human fear is not failure. The deepest fear is one's own greatness, because growth demands responsibility. It requires abandoning excuses, leaving the position of victimhood, and stopping hiding behind the past, circumstances, and other people's opinions. Being who you truly are implies assuming the consequences of that. The version of you that is frightening is not a bad version. On the contrary, it is the one that speaks the truth, sets boundaries, does not make itself smaller to fit into small environments, does not apologize for existing, prospers without guilt, and positions itself with clarity. This version is powerful, and it is precisely for that reason that it was pushed into the shadow at some point in your history. You learned sooner or later that being like this was not safe, that you could lose love, approval, belonging. So you did what any child would do. You adapted. You created masks. You dimmed your light. You learned to please, to stay silent, to hold yourself back. This worked for a while. It kept you accepted. But now in adulthood, this same mechanism has become a prison. The shadow continues to operate as if you were still that vulnerable child, even though today you have resources, awareness, and maturity. That is why, when you approach something big, a project, a change, a decision aligned with your essence, subtle sabotages arise. Procrastination, sudden exhaustion, unnecessary conflicts, urgencies that appear out of nowhere. It is not bad luck. It is the shadow trying to keep you in familiar territory. It prefers familiar discomfort to the risk of the unknown. But here is the turning point. The shadow does not fear your failure. It fears your brilliance. Because if you succeed, there will be nowhere left to hide. There will be no more excuses. You will have to sustain who you truly are. And that requires emotional maturity. When you understand this, something changes deeply. You stop fighting against yourself. You stop sabotaging yourself out of hatred or weakness. You begin to observe yourself with more compassion and firmness. And then you start walking with the shadow, not against it. The same force that once pulled you backward begins to push you forward. At this point, the shadow starts giving back what it was holding. Your forgotten courage, your repressed creativity, your muted leadership, your denied sensitivity, your vital power. You realize that you do not need to become someone different. You only need to stop running from who you have always been. The final crossing does not lead to a new identity. It leads you back home, to yourself, whole, aware, and free. There is one area of life where the shadow tends to manifest with even greater force, almost without exception: money. This does not happen by chance. Money is not just a material resource. It is a direct symbol of how much you allow yourself to receive, how much you value yourself, how much you believe you deserve to prosper without guilt. That is why it becomes an unforgiving mirror of the relationship you have with yourself. Observe honestly. How many times have you worked hard, made an effort, dedicated yourself, and still felt that prosperity never stabilizes? Money comes in, but it slips away. Or it gets close, almost happens, and something inexplicable pulls you back. An unexpected expense, an impulsive decision, a repeated mistake, a sabotaged opportunity. This is not bad luck. Most of the time, it is shadow. The shadow acts in the realm of money because prospering requires exposure. It requires positioning. It requires assuming your value. And assuming value for many people still feels like a risk. To prosper may mean being different from your family, breaking old patterns, no longer belonging to certain groups, awakening envy or criticism. To the shadow, this is a threat, so it creates mechanisms to keep everything under control. Perhaps you learned still as a child that money creates conflict, that those who prosper become arrogant, that wealth corrupts, that success distances people. Perhaps you witnessed suffering associated with abundance or extreme scarcity within your family system. All of this is recorded in the unconscious. And even if rationally you want to prosper, the shadow acts behind the scenes to keep you within the familiar pattern. That is why so many people live in internal contradiction. They say they want to prosper, but feel guilt when they earn more. They want to grow, but feel uncomfortable charging for their own work. They desire abundance, but self-sabotage when it begins to manifest. The conflict is not in money, it is in identity. Prosperity requires an identity that can sustain prosperity, and that identity is born only when you integrate the shadow. When you recognize that wanting more is not wrong, that growing is not betrayal, that standing out is not abandonment, that receiving is not theft. When these unconscious beliefs begin to be seen, welcomed, and questioned, the energy shifts. Another important point: money responds to clarity. People who live disconnected from themselves tend to make confused financial decisions. They spend to compensate for emotional emptiness, work without purpose, accept less than they are worth, or enter cycles of effort without return. When you begin to align with who you truly are, your choices change. Your relationship with work, value, and exchange is transformed. True prosperity is not born from greed, but from internal coherence. When you act aligned with your values, when you honor your truth, when you allow yourself to occupy space in the world without apologizing, money begins to circulate differently, not as a miracle, but as a consequence. That is why looking at the shadow in the financial field is one of the most liberating steps in the individuation process. It is not only about earning more, it is about stopping self-sabotage, about allowing life to externally reflect what you begin to integrate internally. And when this happens, something powerful is established. You stop fighting against prosperity and begin to walk with it. There is a common misconception when talking about the shadow. Many people believe that integrating it means eliminating what is negative within themselves. But this is a mistake. The shadow should not be destroyed, repressed, or denied. It needs to be integrated, and integration is not submission, it is awareness. The shadow carries primitive impulses, unrecognized desires, old fears, unexpressed anger, but also dormant talents, repressed strengths, and forgotten potentials. What was pushed into the unconscious did not disappear, it simply began to act autonomously. And everything that acts without consciousness tends to govern you in moments of weakness. When you begin to look at your shadow honestly, something uncomfortable happens. You realize that you are not only a victim of circumstances, you also participate in the creation of your own blockages. This realization hurts the ego, but frees the soul, because the moment you take responsibility, you recover power. Integrating the shadow requires courage. It requires sitting with emotions you have avoided your entire life. It requires admitting envy without defining yourself by it, recognizing anger without becoming violent, accepting desires without acting impulsively. It is a process of psychological maturity. It is leaving behind being governed by automatic reactions and beginning to choose conscious responses. Most people live in a state of internal war. One part wants to evolve, grow, and prosper. Another part wants safety, comfort, and repetition. When these forces collide, sabotage is born. Shadow integration does not eliminate this conflict, but it creates dialogue. You begin to understand why certain resistances arise and stop punishing yourself for them. At this point, something fundamental happens. You stop projecting your shadow onto others. What once deeply irritated you in people begins to lose its power, not because others changed, but because you recognize the same potential within yourself. External judgment diminishes when self-knowledge increases. This is where true inner strength is born. Not the strength of aggressiveness, control, or imposition, but the strength of presence. An integrated person does not need to prove anything. They do not react compulsively. They do not live according to the approval of others. They know who they are aware of their contradictions, and do not run from them. This integration also transforms your spirituality. You stop seeking only light, forced positivity, and empty speeches. You begin to understand that true spirituality is rooted in reality. It is looking inward, cleaning what needs to be cleaned, and taking responsibility for your own humanity. When the shadow is integrated, you stop living in repetitive cycles. The same patterns stop repeating because they have lost their function. They existed to call your attention. Once seen, welcomed, and understood, they no longer need to scream through suffering. And it is at this stage that many people feel something new: wholeness. Not perfection, but coherence. You are no longer divided between who you show to the world and who hides inside. You become one. From there on, your choices gain weight, your word gains strength, and your presence transforms environments, without effort, without masks, without the need for control. After the shadow begins to be integrated, something subtle yet powerful happens within the person. The internal noise diminishes. The mind, once taken over by constant conflicts, begins to experience moments of silence. Not an empty silence, but a silence full of presence. This is one of the clearest signs of emotional and spiritual maturity. Most people confuse silence with the absence of thought or with passivity. But true inner silence is not a lack of mental activity. It is a lack of compulsion. Thoughts continue to arise, but they no longer dominate, no longer drag you, no longer control you. You observe them instead of being carried by them. This changes everything. Before, every criticism was a wound, every rejection, a threat, every opposing opinion, a personal attack. Now these same situations begin to be filtered with discernment. You listen, evaluate, learn if there is something useful, and discard the rest without carrying emotional weight. This state is not born from pride, but from internal stability. Inner silence also profoundly alters the way you communicate. You speak less, but with more precision. You no longer feel the need to over-explain, to constantly justify yourself, or to convince others of your truth. Your energy stops leaking into useless discussions. You understand that not every battle deserves to be fought. This silence is often misinterpreted. Some people will say that you became cold, distant, or indifferent. In truth, you simply stopped reacting automatically. Where there was emotional explosion before, there is now pause. Where there was urgency to respond, there is now space to choose. Another effect of this state is the reduction of attachment to the past and anxiety about the future. When the mind quiets, the present becomes more accessible. You begin to act from the now, not from old wounds or catastrophic projections. This brings clarity to decisions and firmness to your steps. Inner silence also reveals something uncomfortable. Many relationships were sustained only by chaos, constant complaining, or shared drama. When you become more centered, some connections naturally drift away. This is not loss, it is adjustment. Relationships that depend on disorder do not survive stability. At this stage, you begin to perceive the value of solitude. Being alone stops being synonymous with emptiness and becomes a space of regeneration. You learn to listen to yourself, to notice subtle signals from the body, intuition, and mind. Hurry diminishes. The need for constant distraction loses strength. Inner silence also strengthens your integrity. You begin to align speech and practice. You do not promise what you cannot fulfill. You do not say yes when you want to say no. This alignment generates respect, first from yourself, then from others. And perhaps the most important point, when silence is established, you become less manipulable. The modern world lives on constant stimulation, fear, comparison, and artificial urgency. A silent mind does not react easily to these triggers. It observes, analyzes, and decides. This is a power that makes no noise. It does not show itself. It does not seek applause, but it sustains a more conscious, freer, and truer life. As you move forward in this process of integrating light and shadow, something inevitable happens. The world begins to react to your change. And this usually takes many people by surprise, because internally, you feel more peace, more clarity, more firmness. But externally, not everyone will deal well with this new version of you. Before, you were predictable. You reacted the way you always had. You said yes so as not to lose. You explained yourself to be accepted. You shaped yourself to fit. Now, no longer. And this change breaks invisible agreements that were never verbalized, but always existed. Agreements like, you stay small, I feel comfortable. When you grow, this contract is broken. Some people will test your limits. Others will provoke you, try to pull you back to the old place. Not because they are bad, but because your transformation confronts their shadows. Your firmness exposes the other person's fragility. Your clarity reveals the other's confusion. And that is uncomfortable. This is where many people retreat. Not for lack of understanding, but out of fear of losing belonging. The human being has a deep fear of exclusion. For this reason, many times, they prefer the known pain of self-annihilation to the discomfort of being truthful. But this is a decisive point in the journey. You need to understand something essential. Growing hurts less than betraying yourself. In the short term, keeping yourself small seems safer. In the long term, it is devastating. Silent frustration accumulates. Resentment grows. Life loses color. Truth, on the other hand, even when it causes ruptures, creates space for something more aligned to emerge. When you sustain your change with calm and coherence, something interesting happens. The world reorganizes itself. Some people move away, yes, but others come closer. More mature, more honest relationships, less based on emotional games, begin to appear. You start to attract what corresponds to your new internal frequency. Another important aspect is that you stop over-explaining yourself. You understand that not everyone needs to understand your choices. Excessive explanation is often a disguised request for permission, and you no longer ask for permission to exist. This does not mean becoming arrogant or insensitive. On the contrary, you become more empathetic because now you see human dynamics with more depth. But empathy is not submission. You can understand the other without abandoning yourself in the process. At this stage, you begin to realize that your energy is a valuable resource. You choose where to invest your time, your attention, and your emotion, not out of selfishness, but out of responsibility. After all, a conscious life requires conscious choices. The external world always reacts to the internal world. When you change inside, the reflection comes. It may come as resistance before it comes as respect. But if you sustain your truth without aggressiveness and without guilt, respect eventually establishes itself. This is one of the greatest proofs of maturity, remaining faithful to yourself even when the environment has not yet adjusted to your new version. There is a phase of this process that almost no one talks about, but that is absolutely inevitable: conscious solitude. It is not the solitude of abandonment, nor the solitude of rejection. It is the solitude that arises when you no longer fit in the old places, but have not yet fully arrived at the new ones. It is a territory of transition, and every crossing has a moment of silence. At this point in the journey, you realize that many distractions lose their flavor. Superficial conversations become tiring. Noisy environments drain you. You begin to feel the need for withdrawal, for reflection, for silence. Not because something is wrong, but because something is being reorganized within you. Most people run away from this phase. They fill every empty space with stimulation, excessive work, shallow relationships, compulsive content consumption. But those who sustain this solitude with presence discover something powerful. It is in it that identity consolidates. It is in silence that you begin to hear your own voice without interference. It is there that you distinguish what is a genuine desire from what is an introjected expectation of others. For the first time, your decisions are not born from reaction, but from clarity. This phase also reveals how much you depended on external validation. When the applause disappears, when the other person's gaze is no longer there to confirm your value, you are invited to answer an essential question. Who am I when no one is watching me? And this question is not theoretical. It manifests in everyday life. In small choices, in the way you treat yourself when you make a mistake, in how you deal with your own time, in the ability to remain with yourself without needing to distract yourself all the time. Conscious solitude strengthens because it dismantles characters. You stop performing to be accepted. You stop adjusting your speech to please. You stop adapting yourself so as not to disturb. Little by little, only what is essential remains. You, without noise. It is also at this stage that the shadow tries to negotiate again. It whispers, "Go back to what is familiar. There you had company. But now you know. Company without truth is just emotional noise, and you have already experienced the cost of that. By sustaining this phase, something changes deeply. Your self-esteem stops being dependent. It is no longer born from external feedback, but from internal coherence. You begin to respect yourself because you act according to what you believe. And this kind of respect does not fluctuate. Conscious solitude is not permanent. It is a rite of passage, a kind of symbolic desert where old emotional dependencies die so that a more solid identity can emerge. When this phase begins to come to an end, you notice clear signs. Your decisions become simpler, your relationships cleaner, your energy more stable. You no longer need to prove anything, just live. And it is exactly this internal foundation that will allow the next step of the journey, sustaining your truth in the world without losing yourself. After conscious solitude, a new challenge arises, returning to the world without diminishing yourself. Because one thing is to find your own truth in silence. Another, much more demanding, is to sustain it in coexistence, in relationships, at work, in the family, and in environments where old versions of you are still expected. At this point, you realize that many people do not react to your change out of malice, but out of strangeness. They got used to who you were when you adapted too much, when you always gave in, when you did not set clear limits. Your expansion breaks invisible agreements, and this creates discomfort. This is where many retreat, not because they have not understood the process, but because they do not want to deal with the emotional friction it provokes. Sustaining your own truth requires emotional firmness. It requires tolerating the discomfort of not being immediately understood. It requires accepting that not everyone will accompany your growth. You begin to notice that saying no becomes inevitable, not as aggressiveness, but as integrity. Each no given to what violates you is a yes to your own soul, and this radically changes the way you position yourself in the world. Before, you may have over-explained your choices, seeking approval. Now you communicate with clarity and move forward, not because you became cold, but because you became whole. You do not need to convince anyone of your truth. You only need to live it. This stage also brings an important adjustment in relationships. Some deepen because they are now based on truth. Others move away because they were sustained only by your self-negation. And although this hurts, it also liberates. The shadow once again appears, but now in a more sophisticated way. It no longer says don't do it. It says do it, but be careful not to displease too much. It is the final attempt to keep you partially contained, and this is where consciousness needs to be sharp. Sustaining your own truth is not being rigid, nor inflexible. It is being coherent. It is aligning thought, emotion, and action. It is stopping living fragmented. When this happens, something powerful emerges. Internal confidence. You begin to trust yourself because you know you will not abandon yourself in order to belong. And this confidence changes everything. It changes your posture, your gaze, your speech, your decisions. People notice. Some come closer. Others move away. Both things are natural. This is the moment when individuation begins to become externally visible, not as a discourse, but as presence. You occupy your space without asking permission. You do not invade the other's space, but you also do not shrink your own. And this internal sustain prepares you for an even deeper stage, understanding that living your truth is not an isolated act, but a daily practice, which requires attention, courage, and consistency. There is a common misconception when talking about personal transformation. The idea that everything happens in one great turning point, and from there on, life resolves itself. It does not work like that. The true point of maturity arises when you understand that awakening is not an event. It is a practice. It is consistency. After you begin to sustain your truth, life starts to test you in more subtle ways. They are no longer evident crises. They are small daily invitations to return to old habits, staying silent to avoid conflict, accepting less than you deserve, postponing important decisions, rationalizing what the body and intuition already know. This is where many people get lost again. Because now there is no more ignorance as an excuse. You know? And precisely because you know, each choice carries more weight. Individuation requires coherence repeated over time. That is what transforms consciousness into identity. Gradually you realize that you are no longer trying to change. You are living from a different place. Your reactions change. Your limits become clearer. Your time starts to be more respected, first by you, then by others. And when it is not, you position yourself. This consistency also reveals something important. The shadow does not disappear. It becomes educated. It stops being an unconscious saboteur and becomes a signaler. When something irritates you too much, when a situation throws you off balance, this is not failure in the process. It is information. You learn to use these signals as a compass. Instead of blaming yourself, you investigate. Instead of punishing yourself, you adjust. This is real maturation. It is no longer about fighting against yourself, but about listening with responsibility. At this point, your energy changes, not because you became someone more positive, but because you stopped wasting internal strength on invisible conflicts. The energy that was once used to repress, please, and survive is now directed toward creating, deciding, and building. It is when you begin to feel something rare, internal alignment. What you think, feel, and do begins to move in the same direction. This generates a deep sense of integrity, and integrity generates power. People notice this even without understanding it. Your presence becomes firmer, your gaze more direct, your speech simpler and more precise. You no longer need to prove yourself. You present yourself. This is the point at which life begins to respond differently. Not as magic, but as consequence. Opportunities arise because you are internally available. Relationships change because you no longer accept old games. Paths open because you stopped hiding. And here a fundamental truth emerges. You do not create the life you desire only with intentions, but with repeated decisions. Each time you choose to act in accordance with who you are becoming, you strengthen that identity. An identity, maintained over time, becomes destiny. There is a very specific moment in the individuation process when something changes silently. Life begins to demand from you the size that you have come to occupy internally. Before, it tolerated your escapes, your indecisions, your postponements. Now, no longer. This does not happen as punishment. It happens as a natural consequence of growth. When you expand consciousness, continuing to live small begins to generate a discomfort that can no longer be ignored. What you once endured now weighs. What you once accepted now drains. It is at this point that many people think that everything started to go wrong, when in fact, everything started to become honest. Relationships that were sustained by your excessive adaptation begin to crumble. Jobs that require you to diminish yourself begin to feel suffocating. Environments that do not accommodate your truth become unviable. And this is frightening, because growing also means losing old versions of yourself, losing bonds based on emotional dependence, losing the comfort of being accepted at the cost of your own integrity. But here is the turning point. What leaves your life at this stage does not leave because you are insufficient. It leaves because you no longer fit into that mold. Individuation does not isolate you. It repositions you. You begin to realize that you can no longer negotiate certain values. Not because you became rigid, but because it became too clear who you are. And internal clarity generates natural boundaries. It is not aggressiveness, it is alignment. This is the moment when the shadow makes a final attempt. It tries to convince you that you are becoming selfish, cold, or distant. But this is only the old fear of no longer being approved by everyone. The truth is that you are becoming responsible for yourself. Emotional responsibility is this: Not outsourcing your life, not blaming the past, not waiting for someone to come save or validate you. It is assuming that from now on you are responsible for the choices you make and the ones you avoid. And paradoxically, it is here that lightness begins to arise. Because living in an aligned way is less exhausting than living divided. Sustaining masks requires constant effort. Being who you are requires only presence. You begin to realize that you do not need to convince anyone. Those who resonate come closer. Those who do not resonate move away. And this stops being an emotional tragedy and becomes a natural adjustment of frequency. Life begins to organize itself around this new posture, not without challenges, but with meaning. You begin to understand that maturity is not the absence of fear, it is action despite it. It is not the absence of conflict, it is coherence during conflict. This is the stage in which you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin to ask, "What is this asking me to take responsibility for?" This question changes everything, because now you are no longer reacting to life. You are dialoguing with it. There is a price that almost no one talks about because it does not appear immediately, but it is charged every day, the price of not assuming who you truly are. It does not come as an obvious punishment. It comes as chronic fatigue, as a feeling of emptiness, as a life that works on the outside, but does not pulse on the inside. Many people believe they are paying too high a price to be authentic, when, in reality, they are paying much more to continue betraying themselves. But this cost is silent. It manifests in small daily abandonments of oneself. Swallowing words, accepting less than you deserve, ignoring your own intuition, postponing dreams indefinitely. The shadow acts precisely there. It whispers that it is better to endure a little longer, that now is not the time, that maybe you are exaggerating. And meanwhile, life keeps passing by. Not as tragedy, but as repetition. Similar days, similar decisions, similar frustrations. This is the point at which many people enter a state of emotional anesthesia. They are not deeply unhappy, but they are also not alive. They are functioning, fulfilling roles, surviving inside a version of themselves that has already passed its expiration date. And the more you ignore this discomfort, the more the body begins to speak. The lack of energy, the anxiety without apparent cause, the constant irritation, the discouragement that arises even when everything seems to be fine. These are clear signs of an internal conflict between who you are and who you are being. Assuming who you are does not mean breaking with everything impulsively. It means stopping lying to yourself. It means recognizing that something needs to change, even if you do not yet know exactly how. Internal honesty always comes before external action. This is where psychological maturity begins to consolidate. You understand that you can no longer blame childhood, parents, the system, or circumstances. They explain, but they do not determine. From the moment you see responsibility is yours, this is not a burden, it is power. Because when you assume this responsibility, you also recover the capacity to choose. You realize that you can continue where you are, but now consciously. Or you can begin to build another reality, step by step, even with fear. The shadow loses strength when you assume the direction of your own life. It does not disappear, but it stops sabotaging from behind your back. It begins to warn, not to control. And something very important happens at this stage. You stop romanticizing alternative versions of yourself. You understand that there is no perfect life waiting for you somewhere else. There is only the life you build when you decide to be whole where you are. This is the point at which you stop running from yourself and begin to commit to yourself. Not with grand promises, but with small, coherent decisions. Small no's that protect your energy. Small yeses that respect your truth. This is how individuation stops being a concept and starts becoming a daily practice. There is a silent moment in life when a person realizes that they are no longer just tired. They are disconnected from themselves. It is not physical exhaustion. It is something more subtle and deeper. It is the feeling of living below one's own potential, of repeating days, choices, and reactions that no longer make sense, but that keep happening almost automatically. This is the clearest sign that the shadow has taken control again. At this point, many people believe they need more motivation, more willpower, or more discipline. But this is a common mistake. The problem is not a lack of strength, it is internal division. One part of you wants to move forward, grow, and take a stand. The other part, the shadow, wants to keep everything exactly as it is, because change means risk. And while these two parts fight each other, life goes into waiting mode. That is why so many people feel stuck, even though they are intelligent, capable, and full of potential. They are not blocked by the world. They are blocked by unresolved internal conflicts. The shadow creates a kind of invisible brake. You accelerate, make an effort, try, but something always pulls you back. And that something is not bad luck or lack of opportunity. It is the unconscious fear of becoming someone greater than the old identity can sustain. From the moment you begin to see this, something changes. You realize that you do not need to fight the shadow or eliminate it. On the contrary, the more you try to ignore it or battle it, the more strength it gains. True transformation begins when you recognize the shadow as part of your history, not as an enemy, but as a protection system that has become outdated. The shadow was useful at some point. It was born to protect you when you did not yet have the emotional resources to deal with rejection, abandonment, criticism, or failure. The problem is that it continues to operate as if you were still that vulnerable child or adolescent. But you are not anymore. Today, that protection has turned into a prison. Integrating the shadow is updating this internal system. It is showing that part of you that the danger has passed, that you have grown, that now there is emotional structure to sustain bolder choices, firmer positions, and a more authentic life. When this happens, the energy that was once used to sabotage begins to be used to build. You stop wasting strength hiding, shrinking yourself, or adapting to fit into places that no longer accommodate who you have become. And this saving of internal energy is powerful. It turns into clarity, presence, and direction. You begin to act with less guilt and more truth, less fear and more responsibility. At this stage, life stops being a sequence of reactions and becomes a series of conscious choices. You no longer wait to feel completely ready, because you understand that this feeling never comes. What comes is the decision to move forward even with fear. And this is not impulsivity, it is maturity. The integration of the shadow marks exactly this point. When you stop running from yourself and take the risk of living fully. Not perfectly, fully. And it is there that self-actualization ceases to be an abstract concept and begins, in fact, to manifest in real life. When this point of integration begins to happen, something very specific changes inside you, the way you observe yourself. It is no longer that harsh, critical look that tries to correct everything by force. Nor is it a look of self-pity. It is a lucid, adult, present look. You begin to perceive yourself in real time. You perceive fear before fleeing, perceive anger before exploding, perceive the impulse to diminish yourself before remaining silent. This is consciousness in action. Before, the shadow operated behind the scenes. It pulled the strings without you noticing. Now, it begins to appear in the light. And when something comes to light, it loses the power to command automatically. Fear still exists. Doubt still appears. Insecurity still tries to argue. But there is a fundamental difference. They no longer decide for you. They inform. And the one who decides is you. This is one of the greatest milestones of individuation. The change of internal hierarchy. Before, fear commanded. Now, it merely warns. Before, the need for approval defined your choices. Now, it merely manifests, and you choose whether to obey or not. Many people find this stage strange because it does not seem like an emotional explosion nor a mystical moment. It is silent, subtle, but deeply transformative. You begin to realize that you no longer need to fight with yourself. You do not need to eliminate parts of yourself to be someone better. On the contrary, the more you try to destroy internal aspects, the more fragmented you become. Integrating the shadow is not becoming someone else. It is stopping dividing yourself. At this moment, you begin to act differently without needing to make internal speeches. You simply act. You set boundaries more naturally. You say no without over-justifying. You say yes without guilt, not because you became someone cold or indifferent, but because you began to respect yourself. And here arises an essential point. Individuation does not distance you from people. It only distances the relationships that depended on your self-nullification to exist. Some connections do not survive when you stop diminishing yourself. And that hurts. But it is a kind of pain that liberates, not that imprisons. You begin to realize that part of your fatigue came from sustaining versions of yourself that were not true. Characters created to please, to not disturb, to not lose love. When these characters begin to fall, the energy returns. Not because life became easier, but because you stopped wasting strength pretending to be who you are not. This is the moment when many people say, "I haven't changed," but everything changed. In reality, you did not transform into something new. You simply returned to occupy your own place. And when this happens, the shadow, that same part that previously sabotaged, begins to cooperate. It stops pulling you backward and starts protecting your integrity. Because now it no longer needs to scream in the dark. It was heard. When the shadow ceases to be a sabotaging force and begins to act as an ally, a new type of stability begins to form inside you. It is not that rigid, artificial stability built on excessive control. It is an internal, organic stability, which is born from the fact that you are no longer at war with yourself. You begin to feel more whole, more coherent inside, even when life out there continues unstable. And this is fundamental to understand. Integrating the shadow does not mean that you will never feel fear, doubt, or insecurity again. It means that these emotions stop paralyzing you. They continue to exist, but no longer define your identity nor command your decisions. You feel fear and move forward. You feel insecurity and still take a stand. You feel doubt and even so choose. This is a point where many people confuse courage with absence of fear. True courage is the ability to act despite fear, without denying its existence. The integrated shadow does not disappear. It matures. It stops being a wounded child pulling you backward and begins to be a sentinel that alerts but does not govern. At this stage, something very interesting happens. You begin to realize that much of your automatic reactions were not who you are, but conditioned responses. You were not weak. You were conditioned to remain silent. You were not indecisive. You were conditioned to ask permission. You were not disorganized. You were conditioned to live according to others' expectations. When this realization occurs, a deep sense of personal responsibility arises. Not blame. Responsibility. Blame paralyzes. Responsibility liberates. You understand that, although you are not responsible for what was done to you in the past, now you are responsible for what you do with it. And this understanding changes everything. Individuation requires that you stop outsourcing authorship of your own life. You can no longer put it in the lap of your parents, childhood, past relationship, or current circumstances. Not because these things do not have an impact, but because continuing to use them as eternal explanation keeps you stuck at the same point. It is here that psychological maturity truly begins. You begin to realize that growing hurts less than continuing to repeat yourself. That assuming your own strength is less painful than continuing to sabotage yourself. That being true is less exhausting than sustaining characters. And gradually, life begins to respond differently. Not because the world magically changed, but because you changed the way you place yourself in it. People begin to treat you according to the space you occupy. Opportunities arise because now you allow yourself to be seen. Relationships deepen because you no longer negotiate your truth to maintain connection. This is not a quick process. It is not linear. There will be days of advance and days of retreat. But there is a point of no return. After you experience the feeling of living aligned with yourself, it becomes impossible to go back to being satisfied with less. The old version no longer accommodates who you are becoming. And this is a good sign, because it means that the crossing is working, that the shadow no longer governs in the dark, that the light is no longer in flight, and that, little by little, you are taking command of your own existence, not as someone perfect, but as someone whole. As you advance in the process of individuation, something very subtle, yet deeply transformative, begins to happen. You stop seeking constant validation outside of yourself. This does not mean that you become indifferent to people or insensitive to the world. It simply means that your identity ceases to depend on external approval to exist. Before, Any criticism shook your foundation. Any rejection was felt as a threat to your emotional survival. Now, criticism becomes merely information, sometimes useful, sometimes disposable. Rejection is no longer interpreted as proof of inadequacy, but as a sign of misalignment, and this completely changes the game. This is a delicate point, because many people believe they need to be accepted by everyone to feel safe. The shadow reinforces this belief, saying, "If you displease, you will be abandoned." Only psychological maturity teaches something different. Being accepted by everyone requires that you abandon yourself first. When you integrate the shadow, you realize that you no longer need to negotiate your essence to belong. True belonging does not arise from excessive adaptation, but from internal coherence. You belong to yourself before belonging to any group, relationship, or social role. With this, a new kind of strength emerges, the ability to sustain discomfort. You can say no without over-explaining. You can step away without creating dramatic justifications. You can remain silent when before you would have felt compelled to defend yourself. This strength is not aggressive, it is serene. And it is precisely this serenity that begins to reorganize your external life. At work, you begin to position yourself with more clarity. You do not submit out of fear, nor confront out of impulse. You choose. In relationships, you stop tolerating what you previously accepted out of emotional neediness. You begin to recognize signs of disrespect more quickly and act before the situation deteriorates. This happens because you are no longer trying to prove value. You know who you are. And when someone does not recognize this, you do not enter into dispute, you simply move on. Another fundamental point of this stage is the relationship with time. The shadow tends to live in the past, trapped in memories, pains, and old narratives, or in the future, anticipating catastrophes that do not yet exist. When it is integrated, you begin to inhabit the present more, not in a mystical or idealized way, but practically. You begin to perceive where you are, what you are feeling, and what needs to be done now. Not tomorrow, not when everything is resolved, but now. This increases your effectiveness, clarity, and decision-making capacity. At this moment, many people report something curious, a sensation of lightness accompanied by firmness, as if life ceased to be a constant struggle and became a more conscious movement. Problems continue to exist, but you no longer get lost inside them. And perhaps the clearest sign that individuation is advancing is this. You stop constantly asking yourself if you are on the right path. The path ceases to be something external to be found and becomes something internal to be sustained. You know when you are betraying yourself, and you know when you are being faithful to yourself. This clarity does not come from absolute certainties, but from internal alignment. And when this happens, even difficult decisions begin to carry a strange sense of peace. When this internal alignment begins to consolidate, a silent yet profound change arises in the way you handle difficult choices. Before, deciding was an emotional minefield. You were trapped between the fear of making a mistake and the fear of regretting it. Any decision seemed to carry an exaggerated weight, as if it defined your entire future. This was not maturity. It was paralysis disguised as caution. With the integration of the shadow, you understand something essential. There is no decision without cost, but there is a decision without self-abandonment. And this distinction changes everything. You begin to choose not what pleases the most, nor what avoids the most short-term pain, but what preserves your integrity. At this stage, you also begin to recognize an important pattern. Many of your old indecisions did not come from a lack of options, but from the fear of assuming the consequences of being who you are. Deciding, deep down, is assuming authorship, and authorship requires emotional maturity. The shadow, when not integrated, tries to push this responsibility outward. It says, if it goes wrong, it's not my fault. That is why so many people live waiting for signals, permissions, external validations, or absolute guarantees. But when you grow internally, you realize that the only real guarantee is your ability to handle whatever comes. This does not make you reckless. On the contrary, you begin to evaluate risks with more lucidity, without dramatizing or minimizing. You learn to differentiate intuition from anxiety, prudence from fear, caution from sabotage. This discernment is one of the most valuable fruits of working with the shadow. Another remarkable aspect of this moment is the change in your relationship with error and failure. Before, making a mistake confirmed old internal narratives. I am not capable. I am not enough. It would have been better not to have tried. Now, error comes to be seen as a reality datum, something to be corrected, learned, adjusted, not as a sentence about who you are. This frees a huge amount of psychic energy. Energy that was previously spent on guilt, rumination, and self-criticism now begins to be used for conscious action. You become more emotionally agile. You fall, get up, adjust course, and move forward. Without internal dramatization. At this point, something curious happens in your relationships. Some people distance themselves, not because of explicit conflict, but because of silent incompatibility. When you stop self-nullifying, certain bonds lose their foundation. This may cause strangeness or even sadness, but it should not be interpreted as loss. It is reorganization. At the same time, new connections emerge. People who feel comfortable around your more whole, more honest, less performative presence. Relationships begin to be built with more truth and less need for control. And here, an important warning is worth noting. Individuation is not isolation. It is not becoming cold, distant, or emotionally self-sufficient. It is exactly the opposite. It is relating without masks, without unconscious games, without depending on the other to validate your existence. You continue needing people, but you stop needing to be someone you are not to keep them close. This stage also marks the beginning of a more mature relationship with your own past. You stop fighting against what happened and begin to integrate the story as part of your formation, without romanticizing, without denying, without remaining trapped. The past ceases to be a prison and becomes a reference. And perhaps the greatest sign of advancement is this: you begin to trust yourself more. Not out of arrogance, but out of evidence. You have already crossed fears, faced shadows, sustained discomforts, and now you know in practice that you can. As this internal confidence strengthens, you begin to notice something that previously went unnoticed. Inner silence increases. It is not absence of thoughts, but absence of constant conflict. The mind is no longer all the time disputing with itself, creating catastrophic scenarios, anticipating rejections, or reliving old guilt. There is more space between an impulse and a reaction. This space is psychic maturity. It is in it that real freedom begins to exist. Before, you reacted automatically because unconscious parts were in control. Now, you respond. And responding requires presence. It requires being whole in the moment without being hijacked by old wounds. This radically changes the way you deal with criticism, frustrations, and even compliments. Criticism ceases to be a threat to your identity. You begin to listen, filter, discard what does not make sense, and take advantage of what can be useful, without collapsing internally, without needing to defend yourself all the time. This happens because you no longer confuse error with personal value. Likewise, compliments cease to be fuel for an inflated ego or for emotional dependency. You thank, recognize, but do not build your self-esteem on top of them. External validation loses the power to control you because now there exists a stable internal axis. This axis is a direct result of shadow integration. When you recognize your fragilities, limits, and contradictions, you stop living trying to prove something. You no longer need to convince anyone that you are good, capable, or worthy. You simply act from what you are. At this stage, many people report a curious sensation. Life seems simpler, even when it is not easier. Challenges continue to exist, but they are no longer experienced as personal attacks from fate. They begin to be understood as part of the process of expansion. You begin to realize that true growth always involves discomfort, but does not need to involve unnecessary suffering. Excessive suffering arises from internal resistance, from the refusal to accept who you are and where you are. When this resistance decreases, life flows with more coherence. Another important point: you begin to perceive clearly where you are betraying yourself. Small concessions that previously seemed harmless now generate immediate discomfort. Not because you have become rigid, but because you have developed sensitivity to your own truth. This discomfort is a sign of alignment, not of a problem. It arises to remind you that you know who you are and what no longer fits in your life. Ignoring this sign would be regression. Honoring it is moving forward. At this moment, a natural redefinition of success also arises. Success ceases to be only recognition, status, or comparison. It becomes internal coherence, sleeping in peace with your own choices, sustaining difficult decisions without fragmenting, maintaining dignity even when no one is watching. This does not mean abandoning ambitions or external goals. On the contrary, it means pursuing them without losing yourself along the way. You learn that prospering does not require emotionally violating yourself, nor sacrificing your essence. And perhaps one of the greatest achievements of this stage is this: you stop postponing your own life. Stop living in the when everything is perfect, or in the when I feel completely ready. You understand that readiness is not absence of fear, it is willingness to act despite it. The shadow continues to exist, but now it no longer drives. It walks by your side, integrated, recognized, without needing to shout to be heard.